Hello and welcome to the MTI podcast for the week of, I guess for Halloween, October 31st, 2024. This is Rob Shaw. I'm the founder of the Mountain Tactical Institute, or MTI. And this podcast is where I talk about some interesting articles and links that affect mountain and tactical athletes that I've kind of come across this past week. I collate all of these links and many others in the weekly Arete blog posts that I publish each week. And so all these links are found in our Arete that comes out weekly. Arete's divided into several sections, and the first one is military and national security and foreign policy. And there's several articles that I thought were interesting in this week's Arete. The first was a article titled "Lousy Deterrent Options: The Korean Peninsula in the from War of the Rocks," or War on the Rocks, which is a online national security military type publication, really well respected, and I read it a lot. Anyway, in August, North Korea moved 250 nuclear-capable missile launchers to the front lines on its border in the DMZ, I guess, with South Korea. Currently, U.S. has, I think, around 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea, and we've been there forever, of course, since the end of the Korean War. And for years, I'm sure you're aware, North Korea has been pursuing nuclear weapons, and we've kind of been in this Cold War with North Korea for a long time. Anyway, North Korea is getting closer and closer to having nuclear capability, and I think that's what caused War on the Rocks to write this article. Anyway, again, North Korea moved 250 nuclear-capable missile launchers to the front lines. And the South Korean president, right now, South Korea president had said that South Korea's conventional weapons and the U.S. deterrence, the U.S. United States' treaty and alliance with South Korea would deter North Korea from ever using Korean nuclear weapons. However, the article argues that no matter the conventional deterrence, North Korea with nuclear weapons will have the upper hand. And the extended deterrence that the U.S. is kind of covers South Korea with is what they describe, the article's authors described as the least bad option. And it's kind of interesting, the article authors went into a little bit about how this conventional defense is supposed to work. And it's based on the idea that North Korea's liquid-fueled rockets will need to be fueled with their fuel prior to launch, and that'll give the South Koreans enough time to attack and prevent nuclear attack with conventional weapons. Which is just an interesting idea of how that conventional deterrence is supposed to work. And this is something I forgot, but the U.S. used to have nukes stationed in South Korea, but we removed those in 1991. George Bush Sr. did, I guess, as part of an overall de-escalation. Also, from the article, 70% of the South Korean population wants their own nuclear weapons. And so the question comes up, whether or not South Korea should pursue its own nuclear weapons. Right now, I guess South Korea has a 3-axis deterrent to North Korea. Sensors, again, which would sense when the North Korean missiles would be fueled up. Cruise missiles, which target the North Korea's nukes and leadership, and then its own missile defense system. Concerning domestic nuclear weapons for South Korea, the article pointed out there's lots of negatives to South Korea for doing this. First, it would bring sanctions not only from possibly the U.S., but China and Russia and other countries. It might break down our alliance. The U.S. isn't in favor of nuclear proliferation, of course. And then there would be some vulnerability as they were developing the nukes where North Korea might launch an attack. As I think about it, I think North Korea does now have nuclear capability. Disarmament, these authors argue that it's impossible right now. North Korea clearly is a nuclear state now, and so there would be no reason for them to disarm. And the U.S., in terms of guaranteeing South Korea's protection, one of the issues that has come up is that North Korea now has developed potentially ballistic missiles which can target the U.S. And I'm sure you've seen news reports where they take and they send missiles over Japan that crash in the on the other side of Japan or near Japan. That comes up all the time. So they're also targeting the Japan. So Japan is in this similar situation with North Korea being a nuclear capable country now with potential delivery systems in terms of missiles. And so the bigger question is whether or not there'll be an Asian arms race where South Korea and Japan, if they start to doubt the U.S.'s ability or intent to protect them with this, with our own nuclear deterrence, might pursue their own nuclear weapons. It's just an interesting story. I think we overlook South Korea and North Korea, and it's just another area of the world that things seem to be changing. Another story was in the Jerusalem Post. Jerusalem. Sorry, I'm hacking that up for some reason, but it's about the recent Israel attack on Iran. If you recall, a few weeks ago, Iran launched a ballistic missile attack on Israel, following Israel's attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel vowed to respond, and they did last week. And they, as I understand it correctly, they targeted Iran's missile production capability instead of targeting the nukes. And the headline for this story is, quote, "Killing Iran's nuclear program. Did Israel throw away a golden opportunity?" And again, it said that Israel hit, instead of the nuclear capability of Iran and their counterattack, they hit Iran's their missile capability. But since this article's authors, argue that perhaps they should have instead gone ahead and attacked their nuclear program. And the author points out there's a couple of lines have been crossed, in the past year. First was the October 7th attack by Hamas. And Hamas, as I understand it correctly, is a proxy militia that Iran either funded or had a lot of influence on. And I haven't seen where there's any report that's verified that Iran knew ahead of time of the Hamas plans for October 7th of last year. But regardless, that was a line that was crossed. And of course, there were, I think, 1,200 Israelis killed in that attack. And then secondly is Iran's ballistic missile status has increased. They've improved their missile capability. The question is whether or not in Iran's attack on Israel, I think the Israeli air defenses shot down most of the missiles, but some, one or two or a few at least, got through. And there's a question whether or not Israel's air defense would be inefficient if there was a nuclear attack from Iran. And Israel was pressured by the United States not to strike Iran's nuclear capability. I'm not sure why we would pressure them to do that, but anyway, that's what this article states. Anyway, this article argues that if Israel had gone ahead and hit their nuclear capability, it could have set back their nuclear program by years and maybe readjusted the balance of power. If Iran does become a fully nuclear state, we know that Israel currently does have nuclear weapons, but there's a question whether or not the Saudis, might develop their own nuclear weapons. They are opponents of Iran in the Middle East. Anyway, perhaps not only an arms race in Asia, but another one in the Middle East. And by arms race, I mean nuclear arms. So just interesting times for sure. And the third article was in Task and Purpose, which is another online publication that covers military and national security. So I really respect it, and I get a lot from it. And the headline is quote, as North Korea sends troops to Russia, as North Korea sends troops, the Russia-Ukraine war is looking like a laboratory for modern warfare. We've covered this before, especially the drone activity in the drone warfare in Ukraine, and how that's really changed, had a big effect on our the way the U.S. and other countries are thinking about drones and their capabilities. And we had several stories I mentioned last week on drone warfare and the U.S. changing tactics and training to combat drones and develop our own drones, etc. And this is a story that just came out this week, but apparently North Korea has sent 12,000 troops to Russia, and the thought is that they're going to be deployed on their front lines in Ukraine, which is definitely a different twist. According to this Task and Purpose article, these troops could be ready for combat here in a couple days on November 1st. So it'll be interesting to see if indeed these North Korean troops are deployed to the front lines in Ukraine, and if they fight as units or if they're used to supplement Russian units. But in terms of a laboratory, Ukraine has proved as a modern warfare laboratory for drones, unmanned boats, long-range missiles, and electronic warfare. And I had thought this before it was mentioned in this article, but the article does mention that it harkens back to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and where that was between the fascists and in Spain, and I think the Democrats and others. Anyway, Germany and some of the Allied nations, future Allied nations, got involved and used that in terms of supplying equipment and other things. And if my history lesson serves me well, I remember that one of the things that Germany worked on developing and honing during the Spanish Civil War was air power, in terms of testing its fighters and its bombers and stuff there. Anyway, this article argues that the Ukraine war is proving to be like the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s in terms of being a laboratory for modern warfare. The fourth article, kind of pivoting now to first responder and Homeland Security category. There's an article in military.com that the Coast Guard leaders in Sector San Diego sidelined amid claims of a toxic environment. The Coast Guard is now under the Department of Homeland Security, and apparently the captain was relieved of he was in charge of the San Diego sector, and as I understand correctly, a lot has changed with the Coast Guard since I was in there 30 years ago. But I understand the San Diego sector that this captain was in charge of the air stations, the small boat stations, and probably the Marine Science Department and others. Anyway, he was relieved for being a toxic leader, but also the command master chief at the sector was also relieved. And according to the article, the command master chief is not being investigated, but was also relieved for his inability to fulfill responsibilities of senior enlisted leader. So this is interesting, and it just makes me wonder how the complaints of toxic leadership rose above the command in the sector to obviously this captain's. And so a captain of the Coast Guard of 06 to his bosses had to be another captain or an admiral someplace. And what responsibility would have been for the command master chief to stand up for the people being affected by this toxic leadership. Anyway, it's just interesting that the command master chief is also relieved, even though he is not being investigated. There was also a story or a mention in this article that these two were the 5th and 6th Coast Guard leaders who had been fired since April. And what's interesting was that two of the other Coast Guard leaders who have been fired since April were chaplains. The first was a commander, Presbyterian chaplain in the 7th District. He was fired for poor judgment and performance. There was no further information on what that was. And then another one was a Captain Daniel Mode, I think. He was a chaplain of the Coast Guard. So this is like if I understand correctly, like the entire chaplain of the Coast Guard. He was fired for failure to take action when he learned of the sexual misconduct of another chaplain that occurred before the chaplain was hired by the Coast Guard. So it's the first time I ever seen chaplains fired, and I thought that was just interesting. I thought I'd mention it here. Another story under first responder, Homeland Security. This is in the New York Times that, quote, fatal drug overdoses are dropping, but not everyone is spared. And from May 2023 to May 2024, fatal overdoses in the U.S. have dropped 15%, which is significant. Still, 95,000 people died of drug overdoses during that period, but that's down from 111,000 people in the U.S. from the previous year. Overall, it said that drug deaths by white people are dropping, but they seem to be increasing for minorities. Said that in Arkansas, overdose drug deaths for white people were down 2%, but black Americans or black Arkansans, they were up 33%. In Michigan, white drug overdoses were down 12%, but black American overdoses were up 6%. And in Massachusetts, which is really significant, white drug overdoses were down 20%, but minorities and black American overdoses were up 40%. So I guess that's the reason for the article headline that fatal drug overdoses are dropping, but not everyone is spared. So for some reason, it seems that overdoses amongst the white population are down, but amongst other minorities, the minorities are up. This is just the article just pointed to certain states. I don't know if this is state by state or whatever, but the good news is that they're down overall 15%. The bad news is that we still have nearly 100,000 people a year in the United States dying from drug overdoses, which is terrible, of course. The next story under the first responder, Homeland Security category. I think this is from Police One. Quote, California officer ambushed, shot while sitting in a cruiser. The suspect killed. I've seen lots of these stories, unfortunately, these past few years, of these kind of ambush, seemingly random attacks on police patrol, patrolmen and patrolwomen. And apparently this sergeant was just sitting in his car. He was actually investigating a homicide. He was sitting in his car just doing some work there, and somebody drove up and shot him. He shot into the cruiser, I guess, several times, and the sergeant, in this case, the patrolman, was injured in the legs, but he wasn't killed. He managed to return fire and call for help, and eventually the suspect was killed. But I just think it just shows... to me anyway, it demonstrates just the intense pressure that are on our law enforcement officers out there, that they can never be totally comfortable or at ease, because stuff like this can happen seemingly randomly. And along those lines, but a little bit different, there was a story in Firefighter Close Calls, which is another website, and the headline was, a sleeping firefighter bit by a bear at a wildland fire. And so apparently this is in California, the shoe fire. And, this wildland firefighter was fighting this shoe fire in Shasta County, and he was just sleeping in the back of a pickup, and he felt a nudge, turned around, and a young bear bit him right in the butt. No serious injury. He's back to work the next day, but that's kind of bizarre. A young black bear is what they assume it was, bit him. So just weird, I guess. I'm from Wyoming. A lot of bear attacks there in Wyoming. All grizzly bears, and not too many black bear attacks. Although black bears have been known to attack people. Anyway, turning to the mountain category. So this is like our mountain athlete outside category. Lots of interesting stories. This week's Arete. The first one is from Outside Magazine, and the headline is, quote, "Need hardcore durable outdoor apparel. Don't sleep on the hunting brands." This is in Outside Magazine. There's not a lot to the story. The author just points to several individual pieces of outdoor clothing from different hunting brands. But what is significant and why I highlighted it and included it in Arete is that this is an Outside Magazine, and there's always been kind of an uneasy relationship between the outdoor industry, what I call the granola sports, so skiing, hiking, mountaineering, climbing, mountain biking, and hunting, especially backcountry hunting. But starting in the 2000s, I guess around 2010 maybe, 15 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago anyway, Sitka Gear came out and was the first high-end hunting apparel company. And then KIU came out, and then since that time, First Light came out, and many other companies have started out, big and small, in the hunting outdoor clothing area, and some of their products are really innovative. There's lots of competition and a lot of demands, and I think it's good to see that these companies will be recognized in the broader mountain athlete category for what they're producing in terms of products. I guess in terms of Sitka Gear, I've tried about all of them, and I can tell you that by far the best base layer I've ever worn is a product called the Sitka Gear Core Lightweight Hoodie. It's just a great base layer that I've used for every activity. I've never seen anything that dries as fast and is as comfortable and has a good fit. So anyway, it's good to see these mountain brands being recognized for quality in Outside Magazine. The next link is actually a link to a YouTube video, a movie that was produced by Arcturus. I came about it through Gear Junkie, and the headline is "The Rescue That Changed Search and Rescue and Prosthetics Forever." And this is from a 1982 rescue that was on Mount Washington in New Hampshire. And Mount Washington has some of the worst weather in all of America. And the headline for the 14-minute YouTube video is called 109 Degrees Below. And on this day, it got that cold, 109 degrees to below. And these two climbers headed out. They were in their teens. To climb Mount Washington. Weather went to crap on them. They lost visibilities. Ended up getting turned around, and were ultimately in the mountain for 4 days. I can't recall if one of them perished, but one who did survive lost both his legs, and actually became a professor at MIT and led the development of prosthetics, and has really done a lot of work in prosthetic technology and really improved the lives of himself and many other people in terms of just developing prosthetics, artificial limbs, for people to lose them in for whatever reason. But the reason it affected search and rescue is because one of the rescuers on this, who went out to rescue or search for these two climbers, was killed in an avalanche. And that changed some of the ways that rescuers were treated looking forward. One of the interesting things, or one of the interesting quotes and poignant things that was said, is one of the rescuers who did search and had his buddy killed in the avalanche. He said, quote, "After that happened, he hated the people they were searching for," and he described how for many rescuers out there, and generally if you need to be rescued, it's quite often the weather's terrible. The people on the SAR teams can naturally resent the victims And he said you kind of have to fight that. People are quick to judge the victims, but in this case, he's gotten over it since. But anyway, I thought that was really interesting. I've never considered that, but certainly, especially if you have a rescuer injured or killed, trying to search for somebody who maybe, in hindsight, didn't make a greatest decision. You can see how that could come up, that feeling of resentment from the rescuers. Another story, and I saw this last week and didn't highlight it, but it came up again, was that the U.S. Forest Service is set to cut 2,400 jobs this summer or this year, and a lot of them will be seasonal jobs, or most of them or all of them will be seasonal jobs, including most of the trail crews. I think this was an Outside magazine, and apparently the Forest Service is suspending all seasonal hiring for 2025. It includes all trail crews, biologists, timber workers, and recreational specialists. This was a story that was in Outside magazine, and it said the U.S. Forest Service has decreased by 8,000 employees in the last 20 years, but by far this is the biggest cut. It has to do with budget cuts, a budget shortfall, which is a little bit intriguing. I guess the Forest Service didn't see a decrease in budget since last year, but they did convert 1,300 seasonal jobs to were converted to full-time, which would increase, of course, the budget. And then they also paid bonuses to some wildland firefighters. Anyway, that's what this article's authors explained for the cut in these jobs. But this will affect all of us who use the public lands, the federal public lands in the U.S., especially the forest lands, because there won't be any trails maintained this year, and there will be other cuts. So just something to be on watch for if you're getting out there. Okay, another story in the mountain athlete category here. This is really an interesting story, and it's just a short video and a short story that was in Gripped magazine. And the headline is Ascending of Defying Gravity, which is the name of a bouldering route, a V15 after 11 years and 100 sessions. And this story describes this gentleman, this climber, a 38-year-old climber named Austin Guyman. And this route was in Thunder Ridge, Colorado. I guess it's been climbed 3 times previously, and he got the 4th ascent. But this just shows kind of the dedication. It's taken him 11 years and 100 sessions. So that's more than, he's probably tried this route thousands of times. And he finally got it. And it's just a short little story that is linked in Arete. And there's just a short video. It doesn't take me long to climb this route. But it just shows, I think, just some determination and grit and sticking with it and, conquering this problem. Obviously, this guy has a craft. I'm a fan of craftspeople, and really the intent and the process behind being a craftsperson. And when I read this headline and saw this video, that's what I just felt. That this guy is a craftsman, and he just kind of stuck with it, and and finally, kept at it and kept improving, and finally was able to conquer this route. So he got the 4th ascent. Another story. This is the first ascent of an extreme line on North Zealand's Mount Cook in Outside magazine. This is a story of 2 ski mountaineers, and they just did this here in early or mid-October, I think. It's winter in New Zealand right now, or I guess going into spring. And Mount Cook is New Zealand's highest mountain. It's only 13,000 feet, but there's this one route they got a first ascent on, so they climbed up a route that's been climbed before, and then skied down this one route that is the first descent. And what was this is a pretty good story in Outside magazine, a pretty long story, and they talk about the 2 climbers. One was a man, one was a woman. These 2 alpinists, I think they're both sponsored alpinists. But anyway, I have. I'm hardly a great backcountry skier and not a very good skier at all, but I have been in some situations and seen some situations where you're digging your edges into icy slopes, very steep, changing snow conditions, and I've never been in a situation where if I fell, I would die. But that's what exposure is, and as these two athletes describe this descent, they describe ice and changing snow, and taking turns on very steep terrain, edges digging in, not know if their edges are going to hold, and of course they're totally exposed. They're not roped up or anything for most of the route. I guess they did have to rappel down one small section, but they skied most of it. And just to me, it just highlighted again this idea of exposure and what some of these athletes are able to tolerate mentally and then do physically. It's pretty incredible. Moving on to health and nutrition. This is a story in Wirecutter, which is, I think, owned by the New York Times, and it's just the best ketchup. And so Wirecutter took a look at all the different ketchup brands out there and said that Heinz ketchup is the best. And they quote, signature sweet and vinegary flavors and a smooth, squeezable consistency. It's kind of interesting how they graded the ketchups. One was texture, thick enough to clean to a fry and easy enough to squeeze out of a bottle. So texture was part of it. They wanted a balanced taste, which is sweet, savory, and tangy. And I took a look just on ChatGPT, kind of what's in ketchup. And ketchup is made of tomato concentrate, vinegar, sugar, or high fructose corn syrup, salt, onion powder, and other spices. So anyway, just kind of an interesting story. And if you have to choose from the myriad of choices in the ketchup aisle, choose Heinz. I guess they say it's the best. Another quick story that was in Substack, and nothing groundbreaking here, but it was by a doctor, and the headline is 5 things that completely changed my health. And 2 of them kind of struck me as being obvious, but interesting. One was sleep, and this doctor said that one of the things he changed was he now weekends and every weekday he goes to bed at the same time every night, and that really improved his health. And then secondly was zone 2 training. I guess he used to run a lot, but he's gotten older. He just didn't like running hard. And zone 2 training, or what I call easy training in my programming, which is you can speak in full sentences while moving, is a great way to build aerobic base and get some good training in, but it isn't certainly impactful, and you can recover from it. So I found that as I've gotten older, I dislike really intense training more and more. So I used to love that stuff in my 20s and 30s and even to mid 40s, but now I just don't like going super intense. I'm 56, so. The next article, the economics of thinness. This is in The Economist, and it's on Ozempic, which are the new GLP-1 drugs for fat loss or weight loss. I was interested mostly in this headline for the story, but it doesn't go into all the different areas of economics that I've seen that these drugs might have on the U.S. and other places in the world. It does say that Novo Nordisk is Europe's, I think they're out of Holland, Dutch company, currently Europe's most valuable company, and they are the company that produces Ozempic and Wegovy, which are 2 of the most prescribed GLP-1 drugs. And the article states that estimates that by 2035, 9% of all Americans will be on these drugs. So 10% is about 38 million. So over 30 million Americans, what they estimate, will be on these drugs by 2035. This article pointed primarily to some of the impacts that being overweight can have on people. And in terms of economics, it said that, quote, women with obese BMIs can earn 10% less than their peers. So I guess this is, I don't know if you call it anything else than fat discrimination, but anyway, being leaner and looking more fit can help, I guess, you make more money or get a better job offer or whatever. They pointed to the economics of that. However, I've seen lots of other economic potential impacts from these drugs. Recently, I listened to All In podcast. I mentioned that in a previous one of our podcasts. Anyway, the All In podcast had a discussion this week on Starbucks. Starbucks just had a poor earnings report and announced that I think they just recently changed their CEO or fired their CEO and announced that they were going to not do guidance for the rest of the year, which is not good news for anybody who owns any Starbucks stock. But the All In podcast guys are all Silicon Valley tech people, but also stock investors. One of them pointed out that he thought that what's happening at Starbucks is the GLP-1 drugs. That Starbucks over the years changed from a coffee company and a place where you go and hang out to selling sugar with its frappuccinos and all of its sugary drinks, and that GLP-1 drugs are now having an effect on that. And I've heard this also, this might impact the snack producers like Pepsi, Frito-Lay, all those companies. It might impact convenience store sales. I mean, of course, a lot of that stuff is sold in convenience stores, ice cream sales. Anyway, I've read a little bit about these drugs, and for whatever reason, they suppress the appetite, and so including that of sugar, and they have this incredible impact. But anyway, I think the economic impact of these drugs is going to be we're going to be seeing that for years to come, and it's just a really interesting development. Another story from Mountain Athletes, and I've read this before when it first came out, but Outside updated it, and it's a story headlined "Running on Empty," and it's an Outside magazine. I think it was first written in 2015, and they updated it here, and it describes overtraining syndrome for endurance ultra runners. And one of the people mentioned in the story is Mike Wolf, and Mike is kind of a friend of the company, and I met him through North Face when they had a partnership with them years ago, and he was an ultra runner and sponsored by North Face, and he suffered from this overtraining syndrome, and he was putting in 160-mile weeks and had 2 years of really great performance, and then just had trouble running. And I guess he wasn't the only one, like even for short distances. And what's so interesting about this syndrome is a lot of times when the doctors go in to try to find out what's wrong, there's nothing obviously physiologically that's wrong. And so it's almost like the mind shuts down. His mind just doesn't want to push the body anymore. Anyway, it's just a really interesting a story about this syndrome. And the idea is that perhaps the parasympathetic system just goes haywire. And this is the system that brings the body back into balance after stress. Calms down the heart rate, those types of things. The symptoms of this overtraining syndrome are fatigue, loss of appetite, rapid heart rate, confounding lack of ability, stale legs. And in the story, Mike describes how, it's like his body shut down. He just felt terrible and didn't feel like running, after being such a high-level athlete all those years. Yeah, and I think the idea is that it might just be a mental issue again, where the mind just shuts down after all that stress. Let's see. And the final story under the let's see, kind of the health and fitness category. I think I forgot to mention that. That's okay. Is something that Charlie on my staff put together. He compared multi-ingredient pre-workout supplements versus caffeine. Looked at 6 studies that kind of took a look at these pre-workout supplements to see the effect they had on your training. And it turns out that there has been research discovery of some positive impact on muscular endurance, moderate load strength training, endurance intervals and sprinting, but not a lot of positive impact for doing HIIT workouts or hard work capacity. The problem is that there's like two categories here that compared in one of these multi-ingredient pre-workout supplements. So these are like off-the-shelf, very expensive supplements you buy, and a lot of times these will have caffeine in them. And then he just compared that to caffeine, and he found that caffeine alone had just as much effect for improving strength endurance as these very expensive these pre-supplement shakes, pre-workout shakes. We don't really personally MTI advocate any of this stuff, so we're definitely not an advocate of any type of supplement. Maybe a whey protein shake after you train or once a day or something, but it's not a big deal. One of the interesting things about is how much caffeine you need to have this effect, and studies recommend about 200 milligrams of caffeine, which is a lot. I think that's about as much as in a Red Bull. It's also about as much as in 2 cups of coffee, strong coffee. Coffee has 85 to 100 milligrams of caffeine per cup, so a couple cups. And the ingredients in a lot of these supplements will have, 150, 100 milligrams, up to 200 milligrams of caffeine also. So it's like these supplements are juicing their own ingredient list with caffeine. But I guess the moral of the story is you don't need this stuff. It's very expensive. The impacts are not that great, and you can almost get just as much from caffeine. So save some money and drink some coffee, or just go without. And then finally, kind of in the interesting category, a couple of vehicle stories. The first, I think this is in Engadget or Jalopnik, but anyway, this YouTube influencer or Instagram influencer, anyway, he bought a Tesla Model S Plaid, like in 2022 for $140,000. And he put 40,000 miles on it in 2 years, and now its Blue Book value is $24,000. Or no, I'm sorry, $40,000. So it's lost $100,000 in value in 2 years, and that was just incredible. I have heard that electric cars significantly lose value, and used electric cars are cheap. I'm not sure why that is. One of the things I understand about Teslas is eventually the battery keeps degrading and eventually dies, and you can't replace it. I'm not too sure how long that is or if that's true. But anyway, certainly something's happening, and this guy lost $100,000 in value of his vehicle in 2 years, which is significant. I think it's I don't know what it would be for a F-150. I imagine you buy a new F-150 for $70,000. I'm hoping to be worth half its value after a couple years, maybe a little bit more, $45,000. But this vehicle lost like 2/3 of its value, or more. And then finally, the 5 worst cars ever made was in Jalopnik. They have the Chevy Vega, which I think was in the 1970s. The 1980s GM's diesel sedans. I don't remember them making the diesel sedans in the 1980s, but I guess they did. The early 2010s Dodge Dart. He said it was just a terrible vehicle, and it lasted just 3 years. Some old car, the 1946 to 49 Crosley. Really terrible engine design that kind of, I guess, just corroded really fast. And then the Ford Granada and Mercury Monarch. I think these are 80s vehicles also, and they just call them pure garbage. So anyway, that's it for the podcast this week. A lot of interesting stories and articles and links in Arete. And check out the blog post, and we'll have links to all these stories in the podcast. Now, if you have any questions for me, I'm Rob at mtntactical.com. And take care and have a good week.